You're listening to The Head Trash Show with me, Alexia Leachman, author of Clear Your Head Trash. Head Trash is the home to the Head Trash Clearance Method, which you can use to get rid of the fears, stresses and anxieties in your life. Every week I'll be sharing insights, stories and interviews to inspire you to clear your head trash so that you can find calmness, confidence and clarity in your life and work. To find out more about clearing head trash and creating a headspace, head over to clearyourheadtrash.com. And now for today's show. Hello and welcome back to the Head Trash Show. My name is Alexia Leachman. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now on today's show, I have a brilliant interview lined up. Today I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Thomas Verny, the author of The Embodied Mind and the classic Secret Life of the Unborn Child, which was a huge inspiration for me when I was writing my first book, Fearless Birthing. Now, this is the second time I'm speaking to Dr. Thomas Verny because I first interviewed him on my Fear Free Childbirth podcast, all about his book that was a huge inspiration, this Secret Life of the Unborn Child book. And we had such a great conversation that when he's writing his next book, I think he was writing it when I was speaking to him at the last interview. And I said, when you've got it out, come and let me know. And I had an email from his PR person saying, oh, the book's ready. Could he come on your podcast, please? And I was like, absolutely. So this is a conversation that I had after reading his book, The Embodied Mind, which came out late last year. Now, this book is packed full of really interesting research papers and insights that he's gathered from reviewing so many papers. I mean, so many science papers. It's unbelievable. And so I'm not going to give the game away by talking too much about some of those things now. But just to give you a little inkling about what some of the things that we do talk about during our chat, we talk a lot about the trauma that we carry around in our bodies and in our actual cells and where the information is stored in our cells. We also talk a lot about the collective trauma that we've built up as people, as nations, as groups of people, and how that could be impacting us today when you think about the mental health crisis or the rise of things like anxiety and depression and just disease as well, and how a lot of that could have its root in this collective trauma. And how little attention we're paying to this collective trauma, and how maybe that might be a place that we go to find the solution to this mental health crisis that we're in. So as you can see, there's a lot of really interesting places this conversation takes us. So just a reminder, this is Dr. Thomas Verny, the author of The Embodied Mind and The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, one of my heroes. Maybe you can tell with the way that I speak to him during this chat. I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed speaking to him. Thank you, Doctor, for joining me on the Head Trash Show. I'm absolutely thrilled to be chatting to you again today. So for those that don't know who you are, I mean, you're a little personal hero of mine because when I was writing my book, Fearless Birthing, I had your book, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, pretty much permanently on my desk as a source of inspiration. But now you've got a new book out called The Embodied Mind. And you got in touch to see if we'd have a quick chat about it on the podcast. And of course I said yes. But if you wouldn't mind just letting my listeners know a little bit more about you and your esteemed history and experience.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be on your show again. I enjoyed it so much last time I was with you. It's always exciting and interesting to talk to someone who is as well informed as you are. In terms of, what set me on this path, to writing this book, which was a labor of love indeed, 7 years in the making.
Goodness.
Because there is a lot of information in this book, which is not that easy to get a hold of. And you really have to read a lot of journals before you discover what you are kind of looking for. It's not that easy. In preparation for this book, I would say that I read about 5,000 to 6,000 journal articles and books.
Wow. No wonder it took you 7 years.
That's right. Also, I'm a very poor typist, and I type with 2 fingers. So it takes a long time. But anyway, what well, I guess there are two things perhaps that come to my mind. One is, as a psychiatrist, I've always been interested in memory, of course. So when people come, the first question is, how long have you had this symptom, And then it's a question of, well, do you have any idea what triggered your anxiety? What happened? So gradually, we are looking at the history, and then we look at the family history, and then we go further back to birth and sometimes even pre-birth. So the question always was, how accurate are these memories? And then later on, I began to wonder, where are these memories stored? Like, where's your personal library of this stuff? And that has always been kind of a mystery to me. Obviously, sort of neuroscientists will tell you that it's in the brain, and that's where memories are, and everything happens in the brain, in the brain, in the brain. The brain is everything. Then about 7 years ago, I think, in Reuters Science, I read this article, and it was entitled "Tiny Brain, No Obstacle to French Civil Servant." And so it seems, this is in July 2007, a 44-year-old French civil servant went to a hospital complaining of a mild weakness in one of his legs. And the doctors performed numerous scans of his head, and they discovered that he had a huge fluid-filled chamber occupying most of the space in his skull, leaving little more than a thin sheet of actual brain tissue. So it was a case of what we in medicine call hydrocephalus, literally water on the brain. So this article was written by Dr. Lionel Fullet from Marseille, and he wrote in this paper that I read that the images were most unusual. The brain was virtually absent. The patient was a married father of 2 children and worked as a civil servant, apparently leading a normal life, despite having a cranium filled with spinal fluid and very little brain tissue. So I thought about that, and it just didn't make sense. Like, how does this guy manage, So I started looking into the medical literature, and I found an astonishing number of documented cases of adults who as children had parts of their brain removed to heal persistent epilepsy. And following what's called hemispherectomy, which is sort of removing half of the brain, following hemispherectomy, most children showed not only an improvement in their intellectual capacity and sociability also, but also apparent retention of memory, personality, and sense of humor. Similarly, adults who have had hemispherectomies enjoyed excellent long-term seizure control and increased post-operative employability. So studying that and reading more on that, I began to think that if people who have a large part of their brain function, of their brain removed, how can they function normally? I thought that there must be some kind of a backup system that can kick in when the primary system crashes. So it's like having, a backup system on your computer, right? So then I devoted the next 6 years studying the medical and scientific literature, searching for clues to this puzzle. So that's how I got started. And so then what I discovered is that cells, tissues, and organs in animals, they all form various kinds of minds along a continuum from the simplest to the most complex. So it's like nature didn't just suddenly create humans, right? It's evolution. That's the word I was
Oh,
looking
yeah.
for. Evolution. Well, yes, I'm getting on in age. It's beginning to show. So evolution, took us, I believe, once it discovered the functioning of a cell um, millions of years ago, it then took that cell and gradually built on that same template so that cell became many cells became larger animals, larger and larger, sometimes smaller, but they all developed essentially from the unicellular organism, like bacteria, for example, right? Or viruses even. So cognition and memory has been a slow climb, not a magical leap. And so what I'm trying to show in my book is how this evolution has taken us from the simplest of simple living things, like a bacterium, to the human mind. That it's a continuum, and it's not like a sudden leap, from one of a lake to the other side of the lake or something like that. Okay, it's just a continuum. And so I think one of the important things for people to realize is that for centuries, I guess, I don't know for how many thousands of years, we have really lived in a patriarchal kind of society and culture. And part of a patriarchy is a hierarchical system. It's all top down. Just listen to the words, when I say, who is the head of state?
Yeah.
Head of state. It's not kid of state, of state. It's head of state, okay? And so it has always been from the king to his courtiers, the noblemen and the people underneath that and the people underneath that and the people underneath that. And that's what science has also adopted in a sense. So it has all been about the head and the brain. And what I'm suggesting is that it is not vertical, that the vertical system is wrong, and that we have to start looking at horizontal system, networking, not from up to down or from down to up, but from side to side and all around. Everything is connected. The brain is not separate from the body, and vice versa. The body is not separate from the brain. And so we really have to start thinking of our being as one unified whole, instead of this Descartesian kind of bifurcation of the mind and the body and the brain and the body and consciousness and unconsciousness and all these divisions which are wrong. And somehow our language keeps us bound to these concepts, and we have to get away from them somehow.
And one of the things that you share in your book, a little bit blew my mind, was the worms, that when they were beheaded or like decapitated, and when they were decapitated, their memories, they're able to regrow whole new bodies.
That is so amazing, and it proves my point, like the nth degree. Okay.
Yeah.
These are experiments which were done by Michael Levin of Tufts University in Massachusetts. He is an amazing scientist. Like, he's one of my heroes, really. And he has, at one time, I think he or one of his associates was able to cut up a planarian into 200 tiny little parts.
I mean, they're tiny anyway, but that's ridiculous.
And every one of those parts grew into a full planarian, not as large as the original one, but, small planarians. And they all retained some memory of their previous state. So when they were taught to run through a maze or whatever it is that they were being taught, there were all kinds of interesting experiments, but they all showed that somehow the memory persisted, not fully, but to some extent. So the analogy that I'm providing in my book is, imagine that you have a book and somebody tears out pages from the book. Well, once those pages are torn out, they're missing. There's nothing you can do about it. They don't regrow, right? But also you have lost all that information that was on those pages. But the planaria, they regrow those pages somehow,
Yeah.
And so they regrow it from the tail, from the skin, from all kinds of tiny little parts, which are not the brain. So again, that must indicate that there are memories all over the body, not just in the brain.
But then in your book, you highlight how that happens in humans when you have phantom limbs. So this isn't just a worm-based issue. This is not issue, but it's something that we find within us humans as well, right?
Absolutely. Yes. And then, of course, we have heart transplants.
Yes. And the personalities that are coming through with people with heart transplants.
And that is amazing. And of course, there's a lot of pushback by scientists to accept that idea that tissues and cells actually contain memories, and that when you transfer, when you donate a heart, and the person who adopts that heart will carry some of those memories inside their body minds. Yeah.
And when I was reading the book, because I work with people to help them get rid of, I call it head trash, but also, that will also mean things like traumas, fears, anxieties, and things like that. And one thing that I come across a lot is when we're releasing trauma or any other kind of anxiety or fear, that sometimes people will mention, I've got like a feeling in my elbow, or my knee has just got twingy, and then they get a little bit of a release. And as they're releasing something from their knee, let's say they've had a dodgy knee for ages and it twinges in the session, and then a memory will come up for them. They'll go, I've just had a memory, this old memory's just come up for me, and it's related to what we're clearing and the thing that we're working on in that session. And then later they'll come back and report that their dodgy knee that they've had for ages is now no longer dodgy anymore. And it's almost like there was this trapped energy that contained the memory that was stuck in their knee. And it sounds a bit crazy, but I've seen that so many times now that I kind of for me, that's just a given. I don't know, what is your view on that?
Yes. These traumas seem to get kind of encrusted in our bodies, and it's not easy to gain access to these walled off kinds of traumas. And very often what is necessary is to get into a feeling state which is very similar to the feeling state that existed when the trauma was taking place. So you cannot go there, in my experience, perhaps yours is different, but you cannot go there talking about it nicely, for example, the way we are, okay?
Yeah. Consciously.
No. Exactly. You have to get there in some other non-kind of a cognitive way. So one of the ways, for example, is through body work. So, like perhaps exerting pressure on the knee or wherever it is, perhaps that the trauma is if you know where it's located, that makes it easier. If you don't know where it's located, talking about it and trying gradually to sort of sink back into when you were 4 years old or 5 years old or 1 year old or whenever it happened, trying to get back into the same kind of a feeling state, that will help you to get in touch with that trauma and then to open it up and get rid of it. But one of the things that perhaps I should mention, because I've been thinking about that just the last few weeks, is the fact that, we read so much nowadays about about the trauma in Canada of Indigenous people. I don't heard of schools that we had here, where children were taken away from their parents and sent into these horrible schools. So I'm thinking that people like that, or in the United States more so than in Canada, with the 200 years of slavery, and taking these people from Africa, from their homeland, putting them on these horrible slave ships, and then, mistreating them for 200 years. It must have created trauma in their bodies on a cellular level. See how people, who have been through what, some of these Black people or Indigenous people have been through, could possibly not have left a mark on their cellular being. They are carrying that trauma with them wherever they go. And I don't think much attention has been paid to help them, release that trauma.
Because that trauma must be around today. That's just been passed through the generations, and I think a lot of the anxiety, the depression, the mental health crisis that we're seeing today, this collective trauma has just reached this point where we're not only living in a society that's full of dis-ease and conflict, but you've got this generational trauma that's reaching a bit of a tipping point and creating this huge occurrence of like collective trauma. That's certainly what I think when I see what's going on everywhere. As I think we're all exhibiting this build-up of trauma that has just been accumulating throughout generations, and also because of the life that we're living today, this fast life, this kind of disconnected life. We're being disconnected from ourselves, from our communities, from our families, and especially now with the pandemic. What's your view on this collective? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a wonderful expression. I wrote it down. I love it. I wrote it down. May I use it? We writers do a lot of plundering, don't we?
Yes.
We borrow and we borrow and we borrow. I think that's exactly what I was talking about, is this collective trauma, and and nations have that, and when you look at what sort of our life has been like for the last, I don't know, thousands of years. I mean, there is so much trauma.
Yeah.
I mean, just what happened in Yugoslavia, right? Or what happened in Ireland between the Catholics and the Protestants. I mean, in Israel between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I mean, it's all over the world. There is so much trauma, and very little attention is being paid to the collective trauma. It's all about individuals, but it's also this collective trauma that perhaps we need to pay some attention to.
And I think what I've been dabbling with trauma. So it's sort of it sounds like I'm just trifling with it, but I'm not. I've been exploring trauma recently because I do a lot of trauma clearance work, and what I'm really interested in is the clearing the traumas within us that we have no recollection of, or we don't even know are there, which sounds a bit sort of crazy to those people that don't know maybe the work that we do. But for me, I feel there's a lot of hidden trauma, or traumas that we're simply not aware of, that we experienced maybe as children, but also from my work in birth and from reading your amazing book on The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. I realised that my own trauma around mitocophobia came from my own birth. But also since then, I've been clearing a lot of traumas that occurred to me in utero. So things that I experienced in utero. And so naturally, my curious mind has been asking, when I've been clearing my own traumas, like wondering, when did I experience it? When does this trauma get embedded within my system? And a lot of my traumas that I've been clearing that are impacting my life today have come not in my life, but perhaps in my life in utero, but also in my mother's and my grandmother's life and intergenerational. Like I've inherited a lot of this trauma that I'm currently being triggered in my life today, and I have no idea why. So, for example, let me share with you an example. I was just on social media, as you are, and then a video came up of some of the Jews during the Second World War as families just going off to a train station, in inverted commas, thinking they were going somewhere to be looked after and cared for. And of course, we all know where they were going. And so it was a very innocent looking video, really, of just families with their suitcases and coats and kids and family, just going off and entering the train station. But just seeing that video, I immediately started bawling my eyes out. And then there was a part of me thinking, Lex, what are you doing? Like, why are you responding like this? This was before your time. Why is this hitting such a raw nerve for you? And yet, clearly, that was only 2-3 generations. And my mother was born during the war. My grandmother lived through it. So that I'm sure I was being triggered from a trauma that wasn't mine, that I inherited, that's still within my cellular memory, that I just carry within me. And then I did my trauma clearance process, and then I watched the videos immediately afterwards to test myself. And I was able to watch it fine and didn't cry. I was very pleased with myself that I was able to clear that. And that really started an inquiring in me, like, oh, this is interesting. How can we start clearing some of these traumas that aren't known, that we don't even know we have, but are showing up in our life today? Because what we do know is that today we have disease, we have anxiety, we have depression, we have mental health struggles, we have conditions that are, that we experience that potentially are down to previous traumas that we don't even know we have, that we're carrying around in our memories. And that's why I was really interested in your book, this idea that these memories that are stored within our cells are literally being passed on generation to generation. And of course, so today we find ourselves in this situation where we're carrying around a load of stuff that's not even ours, which makes it really puzzling for a lot of people suffering. I know with the women I've worked with who have tocophobia, which is extreme fear of birth and pregnancy, for those that don't know, one thing they say is that I just don't know why I feel this way. I can't explain it. And sometimes when you can't explain it, it really kind of unsettles you and makes you think you're a little bit crazy. But actually, the explanation is this: you're just being triggered by a trauma that you have no recollection of, whether it's yours, your mother's, your father's, in utero. For me, that's the answer to that question. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. You have heard of lucid dreaming?
Yes.
Right. So, I had a patient who every once in a while, at least once a month, had terrible dreams about the war and Nazis coming to get him and haul him away, and would always wake up screaming and with anxiety attacks and sweats and everything. So I told him that the next time he has a dream like that the Nazis are coming, he should get himself a machine gun and start shooting them down as they're coming.
An actual machine gun or one in his head?
In his head.
Yeah.
And so next time he had the dream, he remembered that, and he got a machine gun and he started shooting, and he shot them all down as they were coming, and he never had that dream again.
See, that is such a powerful tool. I think jumping in the metaphor, or jumping in the dream, or jumping in the whatever's going on in your head, the imagined experience, whether it's imagined or whether you're describing that because it's a way of explaining how you feel, whether it is a deep memory or something like that. I think jumping into the world that we've created in our mind and solving it in that imagined space is such a potent way of healing. I've found.
You have to be creative about it,
yes,
because the same thing does not work with everybody. You have to be free to experiment, and also to tell your client, since you're working in this area, to tell them that, well, let's try this and see how it works. This has worked with some of my patients or clients, and it may work with you. Let's try it out. Yeah. As long as you know that it may or may not work. And if it doesn't work, well, we'll try something else.
Now, what about before we jumped on and we recorded, I mentioned to you I've got a family history of eczema, and one of the things that always puzzled me throughout my childhood was I knew that our skin, we had new skin every month, we were getting new skin. And it was always puzzling to me that my new skin would turn up and it still had eczema. I was like, well, if I'm getting new skin, why is my body creating eczema again? Like, why am I not just getting a new bit of skin? And why is it getting skin with eczema? And it was like, I need to change the instructions. And because my skin is creating this with these instructions that are broken, and so I've been carrying this with me for a long time, and it was really just reading your book that I realized that the instructions that are within my DNA and RNA, I think you described the DNA, and please do correct me, but I think it was something like your DNA makes up something like 20% of the full genome, and the other 80% are all the instructions that basically tell us which genes to switch on or off. Did I get that right?
Not quite.
Okay.
95%.
Okay, 95%.
The genome is made up of 95% of instructions and only 5% of actual genes.
Which is crazy, isn't it?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think the scientists used to think that all that 95% was just junk DNA before, except now we're like, it's instructions.
That's right. And it's, and that's so typical of science. When they don't understand something, they throw it out. They call it garbage or junk or whatever, just because they don't understand it. Yeah, it's typical. I mean, it's the same thing, for example, with glial cells in the brain, astrocytes, glial cells, which for a long time were considered only, like connective tissue of the brain and serving no function at all. That is not true, and we don't have to go into that because it's pretty complicated. But the fact is that astrocytes in particular are very, very important in terms of nerve conduction and supplying the nerves with nutrients and things like that. And they are anything but junk, and they are a lot more than just connective tissue. So it's the same thing with the human genome. Only 5% are genes, and the rest are all switches.
Yeah.
And people have to understand now. You mentioned the word nurture at the beginning. People have to understand that we are all, we are who we are as a result of a dynamic interaction between nature and nurture. Okay, It's not one nor the other. It drives me crazy sometimes when I read a scientific paper where it says schizophrenia is 55% genetic, inherited. That's ridiculous. Okay, there is obviously a genetic factor. There is an inherited factor, yes, but whether you develop it or not will depend on the switches. Which are switched on and which are switched off. So, for example, hypoxia, lack of oxygen during the birth process will contribute to schizophrenia. So children whose mothers are hypoxic during the time that they are being born, or the children themselves are not getting enough oxygen, whatever the case, the fact that it increases your risk of schizophrenia because in the process some of the genes for schizophrenia are being turned on.
And this is epigenetics, right? And I remember I read Bruce Lipton's book, Biology of Belief, and I feel like your book kind of picks up where his left off, kind of thing. It feels like they make it. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yes, that's a lovely way to describe it. I'm not sure he would like it.
Because I remember when I read his book, it blew my mind. I mean, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a biologist, I'm not any of those things. So I love these books because I'm really interested in the mind and all of that. And what I really loved was the way that you described the way that these instructions are, and the way that I kind of made sense of this in my head. And again, correct me if I've got the wrong end of the stick here, but it feels, I understood it like we have this huge orchestra of instruments, like the genes, and basically the instructions are almost like the music. So you might have the flute section, but they just never play. If you haven't got the flute music, you're never going to play your flute section, but maybe your flute section gets turned on for some reason, it gets brought in. And essentially it's just, if I understood that right in terms of switching genes on and off, is it like that?
Perfect.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, yeah.
So when we have, because I have read so many stories of, and there's a really brilliant piece of research I remember reading somewhere, it might have been in your other book, I don't know, about these orphans that inherited the cancer of their parents, except they were not they were adopted. And so they had the same cancer as their adoptive parents. And obviously this whole idea of cancer being inherited was suddenly obviously not the case with this family, because they got the same cancer that their parents had, but they weren't their kid. They weren't, they were adopted. And this idea that you can inherit the behavior patterns, the thought processes, the environment that you're in that actually switches the genes on and therefore gave them the cancer. I think it's really interesting how, at the same time, it gives us enormous freedom and hope that, yes, just because our parents had that doesn't mean that we will have it, that we will live through that we have got a way of changing our destiny, for want of a better word, by addressing the emotions, the thoughts, the environment of our body, so that those genes don't get switched on. This really excites me, this idea.
Yeah, the other side of that coin is also true, that if let's say a couple, the man and woman, let's say if they live healthy lives, then when they do go about having a child, they are in a sense ensuring that that child is going to be healthy, because it is the product of two healthy parents. So how you live your life is going to influence the health, mental and physical, of your child. So it is really, really important for parents to know, like they have to stop smoking, for example, but also they have to stop arguing, because stress is also detrimental to the future child.
Especially while mother's pregnant as well, which is when a lot of...
Pregnant, but even before she gets pregnant. And the same applies to men. Men who are stressed before conception will pass on those stressed semen to their children.
Yeah. And so how much, like when you say before they're pregnant, what kind of time frame do they need to be thinking about that? Is it like in the year leading up to birth, like the conception, or how far back do they need to be mindful of this?
6 to 12 months, I would say, is fair. Yeah, I don't think there's too much research on that particular point, but I think that the important thing for parents to realize is that, how they live their lives is going to influence the health of their children. And so it's, a lot of people don't even start worrying about the health of their children until they are pregnant. And by that time, very often it's too late. Yeah.
One of the things that really motivated my own kind of journey to sort my head out, for want of a better word, was the fact that I have eczema, allergies and asthma. The kind of famous trio that I read in research is but women who are stressed during pregnancy, maternal stress leads to increased instances of asthma, allergy and eczema. And I was like, there's no way I want to pass this on to my kids, because it's an absolute nightmare. All three of those things are horrific. And so I did everything I could while I was pregnant and leading up to my pregnancy to reduce my own levels of fear and anxiety and stress, so that I could try and, prevent me from passing that on down to my kids. And both my kids don't have those things, and I'm still suffering with all of those things. And I'm very pleased. It seems to me like that paid off. The work I did to reduce my stress during pregnancy meant that they just don't have a blemish. They're never ill. They're never ill with anything. It's incredible. But that took a lot time. That took a long time. I needed more than a pregnancy's worth of time to do that kind of work, because I was incredibly anxious and stressed. And I think, when people are planning families, they're not really taking into consideration that piece of the puzzle. And for some, it's too daunting to go there. I know that I've recommended a lot of my clients to listen to the previous episode we've recorded together. And one of the things, and also a lot of the work that I've been inspired by, is this idea that, when you are holding your baby or carrying your baby, whatever thoughts and feelings you're having will just get absorbed by the baby. And I get a lot of women that like, this makes me feel so guilty. I feel so guilty that I'm passing these thoughts on to my baby. And it's like, you need to sort of be mindful of it, but not allow it to make you anxious. But I think it's important to be informed on these things so that if you can do something about it, that you have the time and you can plan to do that. But if you never know about it, you can't do anything about it, you know. So it's striking that fine balance, isn't it, between doing that and not throwing the guilt in, which I think a lot of mothers do.
Yes, and it's natural. I mean, a lot of people, that's their first reaction, you know, feeling guilty. Oh my, you know, perhaps I drank too much while I was pregnant, and that's why my son turned out the way he did. I think the important thing is to tell mothers and fathers like that you did the best you could with the knowledge that you had. Now we have knowledge, we have new information. We have to go with the new knowledge, but don't feel guilty about what you did because you didn't know any better. It wasn't because you were malicious or evil or anything like that.
Yeah. Now I want to talk about food, and I love food, so it's not that, but it's the role that, you know, when I think about, I think there was something else I read, again, it might have been in your other book about those children, if you eat well during pregnancy, then is there a link between whether your children are fussy or not? I think when you're anxious during pregnancy, you might therefore have babies that are fussy eaters.
I don't know whether there is that kind of a causality. I think it's more general rather than that specific, you know. A lot will depend on the stress that the mother was under during pregnancy, but also a lot will depend on the birth process itself. You know, was it traumatic? Was it gentle and didn't last too long and wasn't too traumatic, you know. Then also a lot will depend on what happens the few weeks after birth in terms of attachment and bonding. And there is a lot of research, you know, both on humans and rats and mice, that when mothers show a great deal of affection and love and cuddling and licking with mice and rats, that those children are going to be much healthier than children who are not looked after with love and affection when they are born. I mean, those things make a huge difference. So it's a combination of all those factors, not just one single factor. Okay, so it's also very important to point out that there is no one-to-one correlationship, you know, between, let's say, a mother being afraid of, open spaces and her child being born with a fear of open spaces. It's not that simple.
I had a lady who came to me with her child who, I think her daughter was 4 or 5, maybe 3. She was at nursery and wasn't eating at home, but she was eating at nursery. So she was a hugely fussy eater and was refusing to eat at home, but at nursery she was fine. And so when she brought her to me, I think the first thing I said, well, what was the birth like? What was your pregnancy like? He said, I had terrible morning sickness and I couldn't eat anything. I didn't want to eat anything the whole time I was pregnant. All I kept saying to myself was, I can't eat. And I was like, well, isn't that interesting that when your daughter's at home, she can't eat, but at nursery, she can eat?
Yeah, sure. I've heard many stories like that. You know, there's obviously a continuity, you know, between the person who was in your womb, you know, the little baby, and then the person who is born and sort of grows up into a full-fledged adult. There is continuity, and they remember what happened to them consciously, usually, or unconsciously. But it will have had an impact, no matter whether they remember it or not. I remember one of my patients who came to me after reading, you know, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, and she told me that when her daughter was born, she looked very angry. by any chance? Do you remember this?
No, no, I don't.
No? Okay. It's one of my favorite stories. So she looked very angry. So when this lady told sort of the obstetrician and the nurses who were all present, my daughter looks very angry. They just laughed because they all knew that babies did not have feelings, right? So they said that she could look angry. So after reading my book, she wondered about that, whether it could be that she was angry. And so I said to her, well, why do you think she was angry? And she said, I don't know. Should I ask her? And I said, yes. At that point, this girl was 12 years old. And so the lady went home. And a week later, she came back to report on what happened. And what happened was she talked to her daughter. And she said to her, when you were born, you looked angry. Were you angry? And the daughter said, yes. And the woman said, why? Because you wanted a boy. And this lady admits this is the truth. She has no idea why. She just, every day during her pregnancy, she prayed to God, please give me a son.
Wow.
So when this little girl was born, the lady tells me, she loved her right away. She did not in any way, withdraw from her or abuse her or anything like that. But she says, all these 12 years, in spite of the fact that they were very affectionate with each other, but there was always a kind of an invisible wall between them. And so when she talked to her daughter and admitted that she was terribly wrong and she's terribly sorry that she had this crazy idea about wanting a son, they fell into each other's arms and they cried and they talked it all out. And now for the first time, she says, the wall is gone. We are really in contact. We really love each other the way a mother and daughter should be loving each other. And it was all because of that crazy notion that she had. She never told her daughter, but her daughter knew it all this time.
Yeah, that is crazy, isn't it? And I think that a lot of these stories, these situations that we're finding out about, they're not really crazy, actually. I think we're calling them crazy because there's never really been enough of an acknowledgement of the holistic, even when we talk about past lives or anything, there's not been really acknowledgement that these things are actually true and that we should believe them. They're not crazy at all. Like, we should just accept them more readily. And if we did, imagine where that could take us in terms of being able to heal people and improve our well-being,
Exactly. So the name of the book is?
The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, and the new book is The Embodied Mind.
Yes, by Pegasus, just last week.
Yeah,
Yes.
So it's just last week. So I've been devouring the ebook version on my Kindle, and it has been. And what's great is at the end of every chapter you put some takeaways because you share the science, you share all the research and the studies that have been done, but then you summarize at the end, which is really useful to remind me because for me, not being a scientist or sometimes that reading some of those studies, I just have to really concentrate really, really hard to kind of read through that. And so it's really good to get as kind of summary at the end to kind of remind you the key things that are happening that you've just shared. And it is pretty mind-blowing, a lot of the research that's coming out at the moment. So thank you so much, Thomas, for joining me today and for talking about all of this. I really appreciate your time.
Next time I'm in France, perhaps I can come and visit you.
Please do. Please do. I would love it. Thanks for tuning in. You've just been listening to me, Alexia Leachman, here on The Head Trash Show. If you enjoyed the show or the book, Clear Your Head Trash, I'd really appreciate you leaving a review on iTunes or Amazon. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes for more insights, interviews and inspiration for clearing your head trash and reclaiming your headspace. Until next time, bye for now.